For 110 years, the Titanic has been lying in the dark, keeping its secrets. The survivors are gone now, every last one. The people who could tell us what really happened that night have all died. And the only witness left, the ship herself, was too deep, too broken, and too dark to ever be seen. 2.5 miles down, in water so black that light has never touched it, the Titanic has been crumbling alone for over a century. Nobody had ever seen the whole ship, not even the people who found her. They only ever saw her the way you'd see a monster through a keyhole, a porthole here, a railing there, swallowed by the dark, until now. Because for the first time in history, we have raised the Titanic, not out of the water, out of the darkness. 2 robots descended into the abyss and brought back something nobody has ever had before. A perfect, complete, life-size copy of the wreck. A ghost ship built from light, and that ghost has started to talk. It's telling us things that rewrite what we thought we knew about that night. It's solving arguments that have raged for 100 years. It's revealing acts of courage so quiet that history almost missed them. And it has cleared the name of a man who's been called a coward and a murderer for over a century. The dead couldn't testify. But the ship just did. This is what it said. To understand why this is such a big deal, you have to understand a strange truth about the Titanic. We are obsessed with it. There are more books, films, and documentaries about this one ship than almost any event in modern history. And yet, we had never actually seen it. When the Titanic was found in 1985, more than 70 years after it sank, the people who discovered it expected to find a ship. What they found was a graveyard in the dark. The wreck sits 12,500 feet down. That's nearly 2.5 miles of black water pressing down on top of it. Pressure down there is crushing, hundreds of times greater than the air around you right now. It would flatten a human being in an instant. No sunlight has ever reached it. The temperature hovers just above freezing. It is, quite literally, one of the most hostile places on the surface of this planet. And in that darkness, every expedition for the last 40 years faced the same problem. You cannot light up the Titanic. It's too big. Your lights only reach a few feet into the gloom. Submarines drifting over the wreck could only ever see tiny fragments at a time. A single railing, one window, the tip of the bow looming out of the black like the prow of a ghost. It would be like trying to understand an entire city by looking at it through a drinking straw, in the dark, one brick at a time. So for decades, even though we'd found the Titanic, we had never truly seen her. We had pieces, glimpses, fragments stitched together by imagination. What we needed was to see the whole thing at once, every rivet, every crack, every object scattered across the seabed, frozen in perfect detail. And in the summer of 2022, the team decided to do exactly that. A deep-sea mapping company called Magellan launched what would become the largest underwater scanning project ever attempted. The plan sounded almost impossible. They were going to map the entire Titanic and the vast field of debris around it down to the millimeter, create a perfect digital twin, a copy so exact you could measure a single bolt on it. They sent down 2 robotic submersibles, remote-controlled deep-sea drones, and for 3 weeks around the clock, those robots flew slow, careful grids back and forth over the wreck. like mowing an invisible lawn 2.5 miles below the waves. They never touched the Titanic. Not once. They didn't take anything. They just looked. They photographed every square inch from every possible angle. When they were finished, the numbers were staggering. 715,000 photographs. 16 terabytes of data, an amount of information so vast it would fill thousands of phones. Millions upon millions of laser measurements. And then, back on the surface, all of that data was fed into computers and stitched together, image by image, for months, until slowly, out of 16 terabytes of darkness, Titanic appeared, the entire ship, in full, in perfect, eerie, high-definition clarity. For the first time since the night she sank, you could finally see her, the whole thing, laid out as if the ocean had been drained away completely, as if you could simply walk down to the seabed and stand beside her. They had built a ghost, a digital resurrection, and the moment the experts saw it, the secrets began to fall out. The first thing the scan shows you is the shape of the disaster itself, and it's not what most people picture. We tend to imagine the Titanic sitting on the bottom in one piece, like a sunken toy. It isn't. The bow, the front of the ship, and the stern, the back, are lying nearly 2,000 feet apart. 1/3 of a mile of empty seabed separates them, and the two halves tell two completely different stories. The bow is almost peaceful. It drove down into the seabed nose first, and embedded itself in the mud, and it is astonishingly intact. You can still see the shape of it. The railings where Jack and Rose stood in your imagination are really there. It looks, in the scan, almost like a ship still sailing, frozen mid-voyage, draped in rust, but recognizably hauntingly, the Titanic. And then you travel across that 1/3 of a mile of debris to the stern. And the stern is a nightmare. It's a twisted, mangled, unrecognizable ruin. A chaos of shredded steel turned almost inside out, and the scan finally makes clear why the bow filled with water and sank in a relatively controlled glide. But the stern? The stern was still full of air when the ship broke apart on the surface. It didn't sink. It was dragged under, fighting, while trapped air tore apart from the inside. As it plunged 2.5 miles, the pressure crushed it, the air blew out of it, and it spun and slammed into the seabed in a catastrophic violent impact. Two halves of the same ship died in two completely different ways. And until this scan, we never understood just how violent the stern's death really was. But that's just the shape of it. The scan was about to reveal something far more human, and it starts in the most unlikely place imaginable, a single valve. Now, to understand why this matters, I need to take you back to that night, into the very bottom of the ship. The boiler rooms. This was the engine of the Titanic. The hot, roaring, deafening heart of the ship, where dozens of men shoveled coal into enormous furnaces to keep her alive. These men, the engineers and the stokers, worked in a world the wealthy passengers above them never saw. And when the iceberg struck and the water began pouring in, these men were the ones with the most warning. They were the closest to the flooding. They knew, better than anyone, that the ship was dying. They had every reason to run. They didn't. For decades, we only had survivor accounts, stories, secondhand, of the engineers staying below. Stories that the lights of the Titanic stayed burning almost until the very end. That as the ship tilted and the bow went under, Those golden lights kept glowing, defiant, in the freezing dark, giving the people on deck just enough light to see, to find the lifeboats, to save themselves beautiful stories. But we couldn't prove them. They were just stories until the scan looked at the stern and found a steam valve. In the open position. That sounds like nothing. A single open valve. But to an engineer, it's a confession written in brass and steel. An open steam valve means steam was still flowing, which means the boilers were still being fed, which means the men were still down there, still at their stations, still shoveling coal into the furnaces, still generating the power that kept the lights on more than 2 hours after the iceberg hit. Almost to the moment the ship tore in half, they were standing in the most dangerous place on a sinking ship, with the freezing water rising around them, and they did not leave. Around 35 engineers worked in that inferno, led by their chief, a man named Joseph Bell, and not a single one of them survived. They stayed at their posts in the dark heart of a dying ship so that the people above them, strangers, most of them, could see well enough to live. That open valve is their gravestone. For over a century, their courage was just a rumor. Now the ship itself has confirmed it. 35 men chose to die in the dark so that others could find the light. And that's the thing about this scan. It doesn't just show us metal. It shows us choices. It shows us who people really were in their final minutes. Which brings us to the man whose name it cleared. For this, you need to understand a wound that has festered for over 100 years. The reputation of First Officer William Murdoch. Murdoch was the senior officer on the bridge the moment the iceberg was sighted. He was the man who gave the orders in those final 37 seconds. And in the chaos that followed, on the starboard side of the ship, he was in charge of loading and lowering lifeboats. But in the years after the sinking, and especially in the most famous Titanic film ever made, a dark story took hold. A story that one of the officers, in the panic, lost control, that he fired a pistol into a crowd of passengers, killing them. And that, overcome with horror at what he'd done, he then turned the gun on himself. In that famous film, the officer who does this is named. He's named Murdoch for Murdoch's family and for the town in Scotland where he grew up. This was a devastation because William Murdoch wasn't remembered there as a coward. He was remembered as a hero, a skilled, dedicated officer who, by every account from the people who actually knew him, died doing his duty. So which was it? Coward or hero? Murderer or a man who went down fighting to save lives? For 100 years it was just one man's word against another's. There was no proof, only stories, and a movie that put the worst possible version on the biggest possible screen. One survivor, the most senior officer to live, a man named Charles Lightoller, always insisted on a different ending for Murdoch. Lightoller said that in the final moments, Murdoch was on deck fighting to launch one last collapsible lifeboat when a wall of water surged up the deck and simply swept him out to sea. He didn't run. He didn't shoot anyone. He was washed away with his hands still on a lifeboat, still trying to save people. But again, it was just a story. One man's account, unprovable, until the scan looked at the deck, at the exact spot where Murdoch made his last stand. And there it found a lifeboat davit, one of the great curved arms used to swing the lifeboats out over the side. frozen in a very particular position. A position that shows a lifeboat was being actively prepared for launch. Exactly where Murdoch was stationed, exactly as Lightoller described. The physical evidence, locked in the steel for 110 years, matches the story of the hero, not the story of the coward. It's not a courtroom confession, but it is the ship quietly, finally, taking the side of a man who couldn't defend himself, a robot descending into the abyss over a century later to help clear the name of an officer who died at his post. Think about that. Somewhere in Scotland, a family had spent decades trying to defend their ancestor against a story told by a movie. And the thing that finally spoke up for him was the Titanic itself. But the scan wasn't done, because next, the team did something nobody had ever been able to do before. They used the ghost ship to go back in time and watch the iceberg do its work. Here's the problem the scan finally solved. For over a century, we've pictured the iceberg tearing a massive gaping wound in the side of the Titanic, a huge gash, hundreds of feet long, ripping the ship open like a can. But that never quite made sense, because divers have looked at where the damage should be, and there is no giant gash. The lower hull, where the iceberg struck, is buried deep in the mud. We could never actually see the wound that killed the ship. So the team took their perfect digital model, combined it with the original blueprints, and built a simulation. They recreated that night, the speed of the ship, the angle of the turn, the position of the iceberg, and they ran it. They watched virtually as the Titanic met the ice. And what they found rewrites the image in your head. There was no enormous gash. The contact between the ship and the iceberg lasted just over 6 seconds. 6 seconds. A long glancing graze along the side of the hull, and it didn't tear one big hole. It punched a series of small ones. The damage was a line of narrow punctures spread out along the hull, and here's the chilling part, most of them no bigger than a sheet of paper. Holes the size of an A4 page, that's all. But it's not the size of the holes that mattered. It's where they were. Those small punctures were spread across 6 of the ship's watertight compartments. And this is the number that decided the fate of 1,500 people. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in 4 compartments. She could even have stayed afloat with 5, but not 6. 6 was death, so let that sink in. The Titanic was not destroyed by a massive, dramatic wound. She was killed by a handful of holes the size of pieces of paper, spread just slightly too far along her hull. If that iceberg had grazed her for 1 second less, if those punctures had stopped at 5 compartments instead of 6, the Titanic would have stayed afloat. The Carpathia would have arrived, and almost everyone would have lived. The most famous disaster in history came down to a margin of a few feet and a few seconds. Death by 1,000 tiny cuts, when 1 cut fewer would have meant life. That is what the scan showed. Not a monster's gash, a whisper of damage in exactly the wrong place, and then, finally, the scan pulls back, and it shows you the field, because the Titanic isn't just 2 halves of a ship. Spread across the seabed between them, and all around them, is the debris field. And this is where the scan stops being about engineering and becomes almost unbearably human. Scattered across the ocean floor are the belongings of the people who were on board, and they are perfectly hauntingly preserved. There are dishes stacked as if waiting to be washed. There are bottles of champagne and wine, some still corked, still sealed after 110 years on the bottom of the sea. There are ornate iron benches, tiles from the floors, a bronze cherub statue that once decorated a grand staircase, now lying face up in the mud, staring into the eternal dark. And there are shoes. This is the detail that breaks people. All across the debris field you find shoes, often in pairs, a pair of a man's boots, a woman's shoes beside them. Sometimes, heartbreakingly, the small shoes of a child right next to the larger shoes of a parent. The bodies are long gone. In the deep ocean, the creatures and the chemistry of the sea consumed them long ago. But leather was often tanned with chemicals that the sea life won't touch. So the shoes remain, resting on the seabed in pairs, in exactly the position where a person came to rest over a century ago. Each pair of shoes is a person, a passenger who went into the water that freezing night, drifted down 2.5 miles into the dark, and settled here on the floor of the Atlantic. The body returned to the sea, but the shoes stayed behind to mark the spot. A pair of empty shoes side by side where a human life ended. The scan captures every single one of them in perfect detail. A field of the dead mapped down to the millimeter. And it's that, more than the boilers, more than the simulation, that tells you what this ghost ship really is. It is not a monument to a machine. It is a record of 2,200 people, the ones who lived, the ones who died, the ones who shoveled coal in the dark so others could see, the ones who stood at their post until the water took them. But here's the final urgent truth this scan reveals, and it's a kind of countdown. The Titanic is disappearing. Down there in the dark, the wreck is being slowly eaten alive. A type of bacteria feeds on the iron, creating long, rust-colored icicles that hang off the hull. They're called rusticles, and they are consuming the ship ton by ton, year by year. The famous crow's nest is already gone. Captain's quarters are collapsing. Entire sections that explorers photographed just years ago have already fallen in on themselves. The experts are blunt about it. Within a matter of decades, the Titanic, as a recognizable wreck, will be gone. It will collapse into a stain of rust on the ocean floor. The most famous ship in history will simply dissolve, which means this scan, this ghost, just built from light and 16 terabytes of data, may one day be the only Titanic left. A digital twin that will outlive the real thing. The last witness, preserved forever, after the original has finally crumbled into the deep. And the sea has reminded us recently and terribly that it is still not finished with the Titanic, because in 2023, a small submersible carrying 5 people set out to visit this very wreck, to see with human eyes what these robots had scanned. It never arrived. Somewhere in that crushing dark, the vessel imploded in an instant, killing everyone aboard. The Titanic claimed 5 more lives. More than a century after it sank, the wreck is still deadly, still guarded by the same black, crushing ocean that took it down in the first place. That is why these robots, these scans, this ghost ship made of light, matter so much, because the Titanic does not give up its secrets to the living easily. It never has. The water that protects it is one of the most lethal places on Earth. And yet, in the end, after 110 years of silence, we found a way to make the ship speak. not by sending people into the dark, but by sending light into it and bringing the whole ship back up, not the steel, but the truth of it, the engineers who stayed at their posts, the officer who died a hero, not a coward, the handful of paper-sized holes that decided the fate of 1,500 souls, and the field of empty shoes, lying in pairs on the floor of the Atlantic for over a century. The Titanic kept its secrets. The dead couldn't speak for themselves, so the ship finally spoke for them. The Titanic is just one wreck resting in the dark. The ocean floor is covered in them. Ships that the world swore could never sink, each one holding secrets we are only now, with new eyes and new machines, beginning to recover. If you want to descend to the next one with me, subscribe and stay, because we are going down into the deep, one ghost ship at a time. The sea keeps its secrets, but one by one, we're finally bringing them back up. So tell me in the comments, which wreck should we resurrect next? And I'll see you in the deep.